Okay, so we're going to start off today by showing you how to make one of the most popular soy candles in my shop, which I call Shelter in Place. So it is a 100% soy wax candle with a wooden wick and a swirl design on the top and little wax embeds on top as well. So the soy wax I use is from a company called Golden Brands. It's Soy Wax 464. I'll include links to all of the products that I use in the description box of this video. But when I start the process of melting the wax, I actually use this wax melter from Soylite, but recognizing that you probably don't have a wax melter unless you're a candle maker, I'm going to insert a little video here that shows you, how you can melt your soy wax over a double boiler. So essentially you're measuring out the quantity of wax that you want. I believe I started with 2 pounds here, and just letting it slowly melt over your double boiler, stirring it regularly just to kind of break up the larger chunks. And what you want is to end up with this melted wax at about 185 degrees. That's kind of the magic number for where the wax really absorbs your fragrance oil well, but doesn't burn off the fragrance because it's too hot. So that is sort of the end game of the double boiler. Okay, so once you have your wax melted, either with your double boiler or with your wax melter, you want to pour off a little bit of the hot wax into a separate container, and we're going to use that to make our embeds, our little shells. So I'm adding my hot wax to a container that already had some cooled wax in it. It's well loved. And I'm going to take a pipette and just take some of that hot wax out. Again, it's still about 185 degrees. And I'm just gonna suck it into the pipette and gently fill each of the silicone mold cavities. And you can do this with whatever you want, whatever silicone mold suits your fancy. I do recommend silicone molds if you're going to do this process. And there are other sort of plastic molds that people use for things like candy making. And you can try. I haven't found them to be particularly user-friendly for soy wax, so I really prefer a silicone mold for this process. And so once they're in there, they're going to dry and harden up pretty quickly. I would say half an hour to 45 minutes. You can really get in there and they'll pop right out. So I like to make these usually the day ahead, just so that I have them on hand. Once I start pouring the candles, I don't have to stop and worry about timing. And I just make a whole bunch at once. Okay, I'm going to turn on the spigot and measure out my wax. I know roughly how many ounces are going into each tin, and multiply that by how many tins you want to make, and that's what you need. So you can see the wax coming out here is about 196 degrees. Which means I'll let it cool until I add the fragrance oil, because again, 185 is what we're aiming for. The fragrance oil that I use for this candle is by Nature's Oil, and it's called Sun and Sand. It's a Yankee fragrance dupe. I typically like to fragrance my candles at about 10%. So it's called the fragrance load of your candle. So it'd be 10% of the wax amount in fragrance. This one is so concentrated and strong that I actually fragrance it at 8%. So that's just kind of something that you tinker around with if you're making candles. You can do like smaller batches and test your fragrance loads. This golden wax 464 that I use doesn't really accept fragrance more than 10%. It just doesn't incorporate anymore, so that's sort of the maximum fragrance load. And so let's take another check on the temperature here, and I've been putting my tins together in the meantime. So we're just about 185, 184.6. So now's a good time to add the fragrance. My pitcher is on a scale, so I just teared it out so that it is at 0, and I know how much oil I can add at 8% fragrance load for this candle. So just going to go ahead and weigh the fragrance oil in. And then I'm going to stir it for about a couple of minutes, make sure it's nicely incorporated. I actually just use a bamboo skewer to stir. Some people will use stainless steel spoon. I find that I get less bubbles this way, and that is helpful when it comes time to pour and your wax is cooling. You don't want air bubbles rising to the top. Okay, so the wax, now that you've added your fragrance oil, that wax needs to cool to a comfortable pouring temperature. Again, this is something that you can sort of experiment with if you're making a lot of candles. I find my pouring temperature in a glass container is different than my pouring temperature in a tin container. But typically I like to get down to about 125, 130 degrees. So it will take a little while for this wax that was just a moment ago at 185 to cool itself down to 130 or so. So I put a little hot wax in my Tupperware container, and I put a little bit of a candle dye wax flake in there. So I have that ready to go when I need it, and you can see we're at about 128 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and pour my wax, give it one more stir, and pour my wax into my tin containers. I'm going to be careful when I pour into the containers to make sure I don't overfill them. Since I know I'm going to be putting those little wax shells on top, I need to make sure there's clearance between the top of the shell and the top of the tin. I'm going to pause here for a second just to talk about the wood wick, because I realize I didn't do that part on camera. But you can see into the candle pretty well here from this angle, and what we've got is a wick sticker at the bottom, which is that little white circle at the very, very bottom, a wick clip that goes on top of the wick sticker, and the clip is what you stick the wooden wick into. Now this wooden wick in particular, you notice there's a ridge in the center of the wick, and that is called a booster. Wicking your candle can be kind of a process. You really have to kind of test the wick and see which one works best with your candle so that the flame's not too high, and make sure that it burns well enough. And for me, for this size candle, the booster wick was the answer. Okay, so once you have filled all of your containers, you want to let them cool a little bit, but not too much. And I realize that's difficult for me to sort of tell you what that level is. I like to start adding the swirl pattern when the top is just a little bit cloudy. You can see here I'm just taking another pipette and getting a little bit of that blue wax into the pipette, and I'm going to go ahead and sort of dot the surface of the candle. If you do this and the wax sinks into the candle, it's a little bit too soon. So you can see right here, it's kind of sitting on the top, and that's really what you want. And once you've sort of peppered the surface with your blue dots, I like to take another bamboo skewer and just kind of push that blue around a little bit on the surface to create sort of a wavy pattern. And being really careful just to drag it only on the surface and not down into the candle, because then you'll sort of lose the design. And I'm not trying to turn everything, a medium blue. I want this blue to sort of just stand out on the surface of the candle. So you can see I've done that to all of them here, and I'm just going to leave them very still and let them cool on their own. And then you end up with something like this. Now these are carpenter pliers, and this is what I use to trim my wood wicks when I'm done. Now, wood wicks I'll also link for you below, but they're particular wicks to work with, and you need to keep them pretty short. You need to keep them trimmed once you're burning them. And now I'm taking this just basic sort of heat gun from Amazon. And I'm going to pick a spot where I want to put my embeds, and I usually try to make sure that at least one of them is in a spot that is blue, because putting a white shell on a white candle, there's just not enough contrast to have it really stand out. So you can see I'm barely melting the top. You can kind of see right where it's just getting a little bit shiny. I don't want to, fully melt the top of the candle and ruin the pattern, so I'm really just getting it, sort of melted enough that I can put the embeds down and they're not going to melt, and there's enough wax there that they will stick. So you can see I'm making sure one of them's in that sort of blue area so you can really kind of see it, and it stands out nicely. Hope you enjoy this video on the making of my shelter-in-place candle. Again, I'll leave all of the supplies listed for you in the description box below. And thanks for joining me. Bye!